Good morning. Good morning. Ribhu Gita, the Song of Ribhu, chapter 26. It is called Undifferentiated Abidance in the Non-Dual Nature. Verse 1. Nidaga. In this explanation, I shall tell you about being established in the undivided, which has nothing apart from itself, which is full of itself. May you be in the bliss of being that itself, as being proclaimed to you. This teaching is highly secret and rare to come by in the Vedas and the scriptures. Moreover, this is rare to come by for even the gods and the yogins, and is dear to their hearts. Verse number 2. It has been said by those who know fully that being at one with the perfectly full non-dual Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss, the immutable, the self of all, the serene, with the vikalpas, the imaginations of the fickle mind gone, and thought dissolved wholly and undistinguishably herein, like a solute such as cumin seed dissolved in water, is the abidance in that itself. 3. When inquired into deeply, all the multitude of differences will be seen to be never existent. All is the undivided Supreme Brahman, which is not different from the Self. And that Self am I. By always correctly practicing in this exalted certitude and relinquishing all else, be in the bliss of being ever that itself. 4. That in which all these apparent differences of duality cease to exist when inquired into, in which all cause and effect, even a trace thereof, cease to exist when inquired into, and in which not a trace of this fear of duality exists, when the mind is merged therein, being that itself, ever abide in this unwavering bliss. That in which there is neither a sankalpa, a concept or fixed idea, nor a vikalpa, an imagination or a doubt. That in which there is neither peace nor perturbance, in which there is neither mind nor intellect, in which there is no confusion or conviction, in which there is no conviction or feeling or absence of conviction or feeling, and in which there is no cognition of duality at all, being that itself, without the least fear of duality, ever abide in this unwavering bliss. 6. That in which there is neither bad or good, in which there is neither sorrow nor pleasure, in which there is neither silence nor speech, in which there are no pairs of opposites, in which there is no distinction of I or the body, in which there is no notion of the body as myself, and in which there is not the least thing to perceive, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 7. That in which there is no activity of the body, in which there is no activity of speech, in which there is no activity of the mind, in which there is no activity of any other kind, in which there is nothing sinful or meritorious, and in which there is no trace of desire or its consequences. Ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 8. That in which there is never any imagination, in which there is no one who imagines, in which the universe has not arisen, in which the universe therefore does not exist, in which the universe does not get dissolved, and in which nothing arises at any time. Ever abide in bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, and as that itself. 9. That in which there is no appearance of Maya, in which there are no effects of Maya, in which there is neither knowledge nor ignorance, in which there is neither the Lord nor the individual, that in which there is neither reality nor unreality, and in which there is not the least appearance of the world. Ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. That in which, number 10, that in which there are no manifold gods, in which there is no worship or service to these, in which there is no differentiation as the triad of forms, in which there is no meditation on the triad of forms, in which there is no form of the Supreme Shiva, and in which there is no meditation on the Supreme Shiva. Ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 11. That in which there is no action suggesting differentiation, that in which there is neither devotion nor knowledge, that in which there is no result to be obtained, bereft of which there is no supreme abode, that in which there is nothing of means for attainment, that in which there is nothing to be attained. Ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 12. That in which there is nothing of body or senses or life, that in which there is nothing of mind or intellect or thought, that in which there is nothing of ego or ignorance, that in which there is no experiencer of these, in which there is no macrocosm or microcosm, and in which there is not a trace of samsara. Ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 13. That in which there is no desire and no anger, in which there is no covetousness and deluded infatuation, that in which there is no arrogance and envious malice, and in which there are no impurities of the mind, that in which there's no delusive notion of bondage, that in which there's no delusive notion of liberation. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 14. That in which there's neither beginning nor end, in which there's no bottom or middle or top, that in which there's neither shrine nor deity, in which there's neither charity nor righteous conduct, in which there's neither time nor space, and in which there is no object to be perceived. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 15. That in which the fourfold means for realization of Brahman do not exist, that in which there's neither the Sadguru, the true Guru, nor diligent disciple, in which there is no immutable knowledge, that in which there's no illustrious jnani, the knower or the sage, that in which there's neither the two kinds of liberation, and in which there's nothing at any time. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. And the two kinds of liberation are the Jivan Mukti, liberation while alive, and the Videha Mukti, the liberation disembodied, when you are disembodied. 16. That in which there are no scriptures like the Vedas and such, in which there's no inquiring individual, in which there's no confusion and clarification, in which there is no position to be established, in which there is no position to be rejected, in which there is nothing at all except oneself. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 17. That in which where there's no disputation, that in which there are no victories or defeats, that in which there's no text or its meaning, that in which there are no words with which to give expression, no words with which to give expression, that in which there's no differentiation of individual and the supreme, and that in which there are no conditionings. Ever abide in bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 18. That in which there is no listening, shravana, or connected practices of reflection and profound contemplation, that in which where there's no exalted samadhi, state of absorption, that in which where there's no differentiation between objects of the same particular group, that in which there's no differentiation between objects belonging to different groups, that in which there's no differentiation as affording pleasure or otherwise, and in which there are no words or their meanings, ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 19. That in which where there's no trace of the fear of hell, in which there is no pleasure of heaven either, that in which there are no worlds of the Creator or others, in which there are no fruits to be enjoyed, that in which there are no other worlds, and in which there exists no universe, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 20. That in which where there are no elements, in which there is not even a trace of any derivatives of the elements, that in which where there's no ego or sense of possession, in which there's no trace of the kingdom of the mind, that in which where there's no defect of attachment, and in which there's not the slightest trace of difference, imagination, doubt, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 21. That in which where there's no triad of bodies, the gross, subtle, and causal body, in which there is no triad of states of existing, the waking, the dream, and the deep sleep state, in which where there's no triad of souls, the ever free, having attained freedom, and the bound, that in which there's no triad of afflictions caused by bodily and mental factors, caused by external factors, and caused by supernatural or cosmic factors, that in which there's no pentad of sheaths, the physical, the vital, mental, intellectual, and the blissful sheath, that in which there is no experiencer of any of these, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 22. That in which there is no sentient being, that in which there is no power of veiling, that in which there is no array of differences, that in which there is no power of false projection, that in which there is no other power of any other kind, and in which there is no delusion of a manifest world, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 23. That in which there is nothing of action, in which there is no performer of action, in which arises unsurpassed bliss, which is indeed the changeless state, knowing and realizing which none returns to mortality or illusion or confusion, and becoming which one is freed from the bondage of worldly existence, ever abide in bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 24. That by realizing which, and in the bliss of which, all other joys appear to be the joys of that after realizing which with that after realizing which with very firm certitude as oneself, nothing else will be in the least be something apart, that by realizing with God, that by realizing with very firm certitude as oneself, all kinds of jivas, individuals, will attain liberation, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. '25. That which by knowing firmly as oneself, one has no need to know anything else in the least. By knowing which, with full conviction as oneself, all is known forever. And by knowing which, as oneself, in complete certitude, all actions are accomplished in their entirety. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 26. That which can be easily attained in an unimpeded manner by the certitude that I am Brahman, in which by quiescence after such certitude, one completely full, ineffable bliss will reveal itself, and by merger of the mind in which one will be joined with unsurpassed, incomparable contentment. Ever abide in this bliss, without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 27. That by merger of the mind in which all sorrows will cease to exist in the least, by merger of the mind in which neither you nor I nor anything else will exist, and by merger of the mind in which all these differences will disappear, ever abide in bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 28. That by merger of the mind in which one abides as oneself with no sense of duality, by merger of the mind in which not a trace of anything separate will remain, and by merger of the mind in which incomparable bliss alone will reveal itself, ever abide in this bliss without a trace of concept, in that itself, as that itself. 29. That which is indeed of the nature of undifferentiated existence, that which is indeed of the nature of undifferentiated consciousness, that which is indeed of the nature of undifferentiated bliss, that which is indeed of the nature of non-duality, that which is indeed not different from the self, and which indeed is the undivided supreme Brahman, in the firm certitude that I am that, abide in the bliss of ever being that itself. 30. That which indeed is I and you, which indeed is everyone else, which indeed is the substratum of all, which indeed is one without a trace of anything else, which indeed is utmost purity, and which indeed is the undivided, complete, perfect fullness. By the conviction that I am that, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 31. That in which there are no varying modes, that in which there is not the least thing different, and in which all ego is extinguished, that in which all desires or imaginings get destroyed, in which mind and such perish, and in which all delusion is left behind, by the firm conviction that I am that, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 32. That in which the body and others cannot be discerned, that in which there is no perception of manifestation whatsoever, that in which thought itself is destroyed, that in which merges the individuality, that in which all imaginings get dissolved, and in which even certitude disappears, by the deep conviction that I am that, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 33. That in which all meditation is merged, that in which all yoga is obliterated, that in which all ignorance has died, that in which all knowledge is nullified, that in which there are no interactions involved, and in which the state of absolute truth, and which is the state of absolute truth, by the very firm conviction that I am that, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 34. Merging in which one attains happiness always, merging in which one never experiences sorrow, merging in which one perceives nothing at all, merging in which one never takes birth, merging in which one never experiences a sense of being separate, merging in which one abides as the Supreme itself, by this deep conviction of I am that, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 35. That which is verily of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, that which verily is of the nature of the Supreme Shiva, that what verily is of the nature of the Immaculate, what verily is of the nature of the Supreme State, which verily is of the nature of the knowledge of reality, and which verily is of the nature of the Supreme Truth, that indeed am I. By such conviction, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 36. That which is verily of the nature of the pure Absolute, that which verily is of the nature of a mass of bliss, that which verily is of the nature of the subtle Supreme, that which verily is of the nature of the self-luminous, that which verily is of the nature of the non-dual, and which verily is of the nature of the meaning of the undifferentiated. That indeed am I. By such conviction, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 37. That which is verily of the nature of truth, which is verily of the nature of the peaceful abode, which verily is of the nature of the eternal, which verily is of the nature of the attributeless, which verily is of the nature of your own self, which verily is of the nature of the undivided Absolute, that indeed am I. By such conviction, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 38. That indeed which constitutes the entirety of interactions, that even the least of which cannot, indeed, be conveyed by the highest truth, which indeed is the existence, consciousness, bliss, which indeed is ever peaceful, from which indeed there is nothing apart, and which indeed abides self-existent all by itself, that indeed am I. By such conviction, be in the bliss of ever being that itself. 39. Thus have I explained to you, Nidaga, the state of being established as that itself without any duality. You shall enjoy perpetual bliss by attaining this state, by the constant, continuous, changeless certitude of the undifferentiated Absolute. There are no more miseries of mundane existence at all, at any time in the future, for you who are Brahman alone. 40. Casting aside all impure tendencies, by the pristine tendency left by the practice of the Absolute, existence, consciousness, bliss is all. Okay, one more time. Casting aside all impure tendencies, by the pristine tendency left by the practice of the Absolute, existence, consciousness, bliss is all and that I ever am, and subsequently effacing even that tendency, son, you will be established in the perfect full absorption in and as the non-dual Supreme Brahman itself, and attain the liberation of being the undifferentiated, undivided One. 41. All impure tendencies are of a state of the mind. All impure tendencies are of a state of the mind. The tendencies about the pure Absolute are also of a state of the mind. The Supreme has no such changing tendencies. Hence be established in this, without any tendencies of the mind, whether considered pure or considered impure, like a motionless piece of stone or wood, and without any strain be in this bliss. 42. Having disassociated from the imaginings of all other thoughts, by the conviction of being the undivided Absolute, and forgetting even the sad conviction of being the Absolute, you yourself abide as the perfectly full Brahman. Even if a great sinner in this world hears this explanation as now explained and understands it, he shall, rid of all the great sins of his ego, abide as the nature of the undivided, undifferentiated Absolute. 43. The endless Vedas, in revealing here and there the means of meditation for mental purification, have indicated only rock-like, motionless merger with and absorption in the unaffected mass of bliss, the undivided, complete, perfectly full Shiva as the means for the happy liberation of those who are mentally purified. 44. Therefore, one can here attain the undifferentiated liberation by abiding as just that itself, and with a purified mind arising out of the practice of the meditation, that whatever is known is Shiva, and that Shiva am I. Whatever is stated here is the truth. Thus the sage Ribhu explained in full to Nidaga the abidance in the true state. 45. It is the undivided form of our Supreme Lord in a state of sublime, joyous dance that says, by the conviction that I am ever the reality, which is existence, consciousness, bliss, and by the state of abiding at one with that, being that itself, the empty bondage of the world can be cut asunder and pure liberation attained. And that's the end of chapter 26. Have a great day. Bye for now.